A snowstorm howled through the Cascade wilderness when Grace saw it. Something barely alive collapsed in the road, matted with frost. A lynx cub on the brink of death. She didn't hesitate. She cradled it in her coat, unaware that this moment would change both their lives forever. But the wild takes what it needs. The lynx vanished, leaving only paw prints behind. For years passed. Silence. Then one night he came back, not alone, not the same. And what he brought with him was more than just a message. It was a revelation Grace never saw coming. Fire in the snow. The wind screamed across the mountain road like a living thing, flinging sheets of snow against the windshield. Grace Halberg leaned forward in her seat, squinting to the haze, hands clenched white around the steering wheel. Her old Ford Bronco groaned under the strain, tires crunching over the icy gravel of Washington's Highway 20, the loneliest stretch in Cascades. The radio crackled, then cut to silence. Outside, the world had turned to ash and frost. She wasn't supposed to be out this late. Her field study had run long. Again, a day of tracking mountain hares had slipped into a dusk of measuring snowpack, and before she knew it, night had wrapped around her like a shroud. She glanced at the clock. 6:47 p.m. Another hour till home. Just as she eased around a bend, something flickered in the headlights, a blur against the snow. Grace's heart jolted. She hit the brakes. The Bronco skidded slightly, but held. There, lying right in the middle of the road, barely visible under a crust of snow, was a small, crumpled shape. Not a branch, not debris. Something breathing, something alive. Grace grabbed her headlamp, flung open the door, and stepped into the icy wind. Snowflakes stung her face like glass splinters. The cold bit instantly through her coat. As she approached, she saw it clearer. Tufts of silver gray fur, ears tipped with black, a stubby tail twitching weakly. A lynx cub, no older than 4 months. Its eyes blinked slowly, coated in frost, half closed with exhaustion. One paw was tucked beneath it at an odd angle. Its ribs showed beneath its thick coat. It didn't even flinch as she knelt beside it, just breathed, shallow and fragile. Grace's heart slammed in her chest. A North American lynx, endangered in this region, rare, wild, and dying. No, 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 she murmured, unzipping her jacket and gently lifting the cub against her chest. It was lighter than it should have been, like holding bones and fur wrapped in cold. "I got you," she whispered, barely believing it herself. "You're not dying tonight." She dashed back to the truck, slammed the door shut behind her, and turned the heater to full blast. The cub barely moved. Its ear twitched. That was all. Grace knew she was taking a risk. Wildlife rescue regulations said to contact authorities first. But this wasn't the time for paperwork. If she left the cub in the storm, it would be dead within the hour. As she drove, one hand on the wheel and the other gently steadying the cub, she glanced down. Its eyes had opened, just barely, pale amber, clouded, watching her. There was no fear in them, just something else, something she couldn't name. Maybe recognition, maybe surrender. The snow thickened as she climbed the switchbacks toward her cabin in the foothills. The radio was dead and the night pressed in close. Inside her coat, the lynx's breathing slowed, then steadied. And Grace, who had spent her life studying the wild, tracking, measuring, observing from a distance, realized that somehow she had crossed a line. She wasn't just a biologist anymore. She had just become a part of something she didn't yet understand. The storm followed her home. Snow swirled around the wooden eaves of Grace's cabin, nestled deep in the shadow of Mount Buckner. She parked beneath the overhang, cut the engine, and opened the passenger door slowly. The lynx cub hadn't moved, curled against the fold of her coat, chest rising and falling like distant waves. Inside, warmth met them, a fire already glowing from the wood stove, the scent of cedar and old coffee still lingering in the air. Jasper, her golden retriever, lifted his head from the rug and gave a low, curious whine. "Easy," she murmured, slipping off her boots. "We've got company." She placed the lynx gently in a padded crate lined with old fleece and moved quickly into triage mode. Warm saline, rehydration mix, an electric heating pad beneath the crate. She clipped the thermometer to the cub's ear, 94 degrees Fahrenheit. Hypothermia, but not past saving. Her hands moved by instinct, fast but careful. She wasn't a vet, But she'd done this too many times before: owls with broken wings, deer hit by cars, raccoons abandoned under porches. But this was different. This was wild, untouchable. This was Lynx. As the heat began to work through the cub's body, its shivering turned from violent to soft, then stopped. Grace sat cross-legged nearby, watching. It opened its eyes again just a crack and looked straight at her. Those eyes, pale gold rimmed with darker amber, like winter sun through ice. The pupils narrowed not from fear, but fatigue. Still it saw her, and it stayed. Jasper patted over, curious. The lynx blinked once, its ears twitching. But it didn't growl, didn't hiss. Grace watched in disbelief as her old retriever lay down beside the crate, as if standing guard. For a long time, no one moved. The wind moaned outside like some distant ghost of the forest. Inside, the only sound was a slow crackle of firewood and the steady breathing of something not yet gone. Grace reached for her notebook and scribbled one line across the top of a fresh page. Unidentified male lynx cub, estimated 4 months. Condition, critical but fighting. She paused, then added a second line beneath it. Took him from the snow, but he brought something with him. Winter of trust. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm of care, silence, and slow, fragile hope. Grace kept the cabin quiet. No loud sounds, no visitors. She canceled her upcoming fieldwork reports and postponed her duties at the local wildlife station. Nothing mattered more now than the creature curled inside the crate by the fire. A young lynx who had no name, no origin, and no reason to trust her. At first, he didn't eat. He would turn his head from even the softest broth she warmed and offered through a syringe. But she persisted, hour by hour. Grace heated towels, swapped bedding, whispered gently every time she passed by. Her voice stayed soft, low, steady, a tether between worlds. On the third morning, the lynx licked the tip of the syringe. Just once, but it was enough. By the fifth, he was taking in small amounts of food on his own. Boiled venison, goat's milk mixed with supplements. No sudden movements. No direct eye contact. She let him choose the pace. Wild animals didn't forget fear, but sometimes they remembered mercy. Grace spent long hours sitting across the room, scribbling in her notebook, pretending not to watch. But she was always watching. She charted his vitals, tracked his healing paw. It had likely been crushed in a fall or twisted during a desperate run. She trimmed back dead for around frostbitten tips and applied ointment to his healing pads. He never growled, never hissed, but neither did he come close. One afternoon, as the snow fell in thick, lazy spirals outside, Jasper trotted over to the crate and lay beside it again, his big tail thumping slowly. The lynx was awake, watching. After a long minute, he extended a paw, not in aggression, not in warning, but until it barely touched the wire of the crate near Jasper's muzzle. The dog didn't move, just blinked, then licked the air once as if to say, "I see you." Grace felt something shift inside her chest. Trust wasn't built in grand gestures. It came in glances, silence, small offerings made and returned. She didn't name him. Couldn't. That would cross a line. But she began referring to him in her notes as the wild boy. And that's what he was. Injured but proud. Hesitant but watching. One evening, after weeks of progress, she left the crate door open. He didn't bolt. He stepped out slowly, silently, and curled beside the fireplace, 10 feet away from her, but closer than he had ever dared. Grace didn't move. She just sat there, notebook in hand, tears stinging her eyes, not from sadness, but from awe. She had seen creatures fight to live, but never like this. Grace began to sleep on the couch, not because her bed wasn't warm, or because she couldn't leave the lynx alone. He was healing steadily now, but because something had changed. The atmosphere in the cabin had become sacred, suspended between worlds. She didn't want to miss anything. Not the soft tread of the cub exploring at night. Not the faint sounds of Jasper's gentle snoring as he lay curled nearby. And especially not the moments when the lynx seemed to forget he was supposed to be afraid. The crate remained open but untouched. The wild boy had claimed his own space now. A corner of the hearth rug where the heat from the fire fell in golden waves across his fur. His coat had thickened again, silver gray with pale spots that shimmered like frost. The black tufts on his ears flicked with every creak of wood, every gust of wind through the eaves. He still limped slightly on his left paw, But it didn't slow him much. Grace kept her distance. No touching. No sudden movements. She knew the rules. This wasn't a pet. He was wild, and he would return to the wild. But that didn't stop her from speaking to him. Quietly, steadily, as if narrating the passing of time. "Storm tonight," she'd whisper as the wind howled outside. Or, "Sun came to the trees this morning, made the whole trail glow gold." Or sometimes nothing at all, just humming while she sketched at the kitchen table, sipping hot tea, the fire crackling between them like a mutual understanding. She drew him constantly, on her notes, napkins, the backs of bills. Always from memory, never direct. It felt like a ritual, capturing not just his image, but his presence. The tension of his muscles when he rose to stretch, the way his eyes stayed locked on the horizon even from indoors, the subtle tilt of his head when Jasper yawned. One evening, she left her sketchbook on the floor by accident. She returned from chopping firewood to find the lynx crouched beside it, paw hovering above a page. His amber eyes met hers. For a long breath, neither of them moved. Then he nudged the book toward her with his nose, deliberate, slow, and impossibly gentle. She swallowed the lump in her throat. "Did you see yourself?" she asked softly. The wild boy blinked once, then padded silently back to the fire. Later that night, as Grace curled into the couch under a heavy quilt, she heard Jasper shift. She opened one eye. The lynx had moved. He was at the foot of the couch, not touching, not asking, but near enough to feel the warmth, near enough to choose her company. Grace didn't reach for him. She just whispered into the stillness, "You're safe here." The wind quieted. The fire crackled low. And in that moment, trust lived in the silence between them. Letting go hurts. The thaw came slowly that year. Snow melted from the edges inward, revealing damp patches of moss and earth, the forest waking in patches like a great beast stirring from slumber. The river behind Grace's cabin roared with spring runoff, carrying chunks of ice and forgotten branches downstream. And with the shift in season came the quiet truth she had been avoiding. He was ready. The wild boy had grown leaner, stronger. His injured paw had healed with only the faintest hitch in his step. His coat now gleamed in the sunlight, silver gray with hints of amber around the neck, black spots scattered like ash across the sides. He moved with silent precision, his instincts sharpening by the day. One morning, Grace opened the door to fetch firewood and found him perched on the railing of the deck, watching a raven circle above the tree-line. He didn't flinch when the wind ruffled his fur. He just watched, eyes wide, alert. She knew what that look meant. He wasn't hers. He never had been. Grace spent the next week preparing a soft-release enclosure at the edge of the woods, just beyond the stream, a half-acre pen surrounded by mesh fencing with tall grass, stumps, and climbing logs. She stocked it with live prey, mice, quail, even fish in a shallow pond, testing his ability to hunt and survive. He didn't disappoint. Every night, he returned to the cabin, but with increasing hesitation. He stayed only minutes now, pacing, restless. He no longer curled by the fire. He slept outside beneath the porch or in the brush nearby. Jasper, now aging and slower, still wagged his tail when the lynx appeared. But even the dogs seemed to understand. Some creatures weren't meant to stay. The night before the final release, Grace sat by the hearth with her sketchbook. This time, she drew him from memory, but not as a shivering cub she'd found in the snow. She drew him proud, standing at the tree-line, ears high, eyes distant. When she looked up, he was there, just beyond the doorway, outlined in moonlight, watching her. She stood slowly, walked to the open door, and said the words she'd been rehearsing for days. "You can go now. You made it." The lynx stepped forward, paused a few feet from her. Their eyes met. No words, no sound. And then he turned, silent as a shadow, and vanished into the trees. Grace stood in the doorway long after he was gone, arms wrapped around herself, breath fogging in the cold spring air. It wasn't just grief. It was awe, because she knew she hadn't just saved a life. She had witnessed something ancient, something rare, the moment when a wild soul chooses the world again. Grace didn't expect the silence to hurt as much as it did. The mornings came bright and brisk, sun glinting off the wet pine needles, the air still sharp enough to bite. Jasper would trot out to the porch, stretch, and sniff the wind like he always had. but there was no shape crouched under the steps anymore. No rustle in the brush. No amber eyes waiting at the tree lean. She still left the door cracked for a few nights. Out of habit, she still listened for soft paws on the deck. But the wild boy didn't come back. Not that first week. Not the second. The soft-release pen remained untouched, its gate now hanging open. He was gone. Grace buried herself in work. She logged wildlife data, answered overdue emails from the research station, filed reports that felt suddenly hollow. Everything was functional, clinical, numbers and tags and dates. None of it came close to what she'd just lived through. Sometimes, late at night, she'd catch herself sketching without realizing it. The same profile, over and over. The high cheekbones, the tall ears, the curved tail. Sometimes alone. Sometimes next to Jasper. Always facing away. Neighbors ask questions. Was it a bobcat? Did you tag it? Think it'll come back? She gave polite answers. Kept the truth in her chest where it pulsed like a bruise. Then one afternoon, she found Jasper standing at the far edge of the yard, tail stiff, nose pointed toward the north ridge. Grace stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the glare. The ridge was empty. Still, but the dog wouldn't budge. He stood like a statue for a full 5 minutes before finally turning back, ears low, gaze flicking toward the trees. She didn't need to see it to know. He had passed this way again. But he hadn't come to stay. That night, Grace sat by the fire with her old green journal, the one she only opened when something mattered. She wrote, "It's a strange kind of pain to raise something wild, to get every piece of yourself, and then to lose it by doing everything right." She closed the book. Jasper lay at her feet, chin on his paws, eyes half closed. Grace reached down and scratched behind his ears. "You miss him too, don't you?" The dog thumped his tail once in answer. Outside, spring crept in quietly, buds forming on the maple trees. Frogs beginning to call from the edge of the river. Life went on, just without the boy who had once fit in her arms like a whisper of frost. But she knew this wasn't the end. The forest had its own kind of rhythm. And wild things, when they choose to return, always have a reason. For years of silence. For years past. Not quickly. Not softly. They unfolded in the slow, steady rhythm of mountain life. Frost and melt, bloom and fade. Each season carving itself into Grace Halberg like rings in an old pine. The lynx never returned. Not once. And yet, he was everywhere. She expanded her sanctuary that first summer, fencing off more land, building a weatherproof shed to house supplies and temporary habitats. Injured owls, orphan fawns, even a black bear cub once. She cared for them all. Word had spread about her work, and the calls kept coming. There's a hawk with broken wing, or a raccoon was hit near the quarry. But none of them stayed. They all left eventually. That was the goal, after all. Still, each release took a little more from her. Jasper slowed with age. His golden fur paled at the muzzle and his eyes clouded, but he never stopped rising to greet her at dawn or padding beside her along the wooded trails. Some mornings he would stop at the same ridge, the one where the lynx had first vanished, and sniff the air as if listening for echoes. Grace never stopped him. She stood beside him in silence, letting the past pass through her like wind through branches. Her life became quieter, more internal. The world beyond the woods felt like something imagined. Phone screens, city noise, synthetic urgency. But the forest? It breathed. It remembered. She stopped drawing. The sketchbooks were stacked in a drawer now, their pages filled with amber eyes and winter shadows. Occasionally, on long evenings, she'd pull one out and flip through the memories, but she no longer added to them, until Jasper died. It happened in October, just as the last of the maple leaves turned to fire. One morning, Grace awoke to find him curled on the porch beside the empty food dish, facing the forest like a sentinel. He had passed in his sleep. Grace sat beside him for hours. Didn't cry. Didn't move. Only when the sun dipped below the ridge did she wrap him in his favorite wool blanket and carry him to the back clearing where the soil was soft. She buried him with a small bundle of pine cones and a strip of flannel from her childhood. For days afterward, she couldn't bear the silence, the absence of paws on hardwood, the way the porch creaked without him there. And yet, in that stillness, something ancient stirred. A memory, a presence, or maybe just instinct. Grace began walking the old trails again, deeper into the woods than she had in years. places she hadn't dared explore since that winter. She saw cougar tracks once, elk, even a black bear sow with cubs. But no lynx, no sign of the wild boy. Still, she spoke to the woods as she walked, just as she used to speak to him. "I miss you," she'd whisper. "I wonder if you remember. Are you alive out there?" And sometimes she'd stop, listen, just in case the forest decided to answer. The day Jasper died marked more than the loss of a companion. It marked the end of a chapter Grace hadn't realized was still open. That night, the cabin felt too large, too still. The fire crackled dutifully, but its warmth didn't reach the corners of the room. She wandered through her journals, old files, unopened letters. Her hand stopped on a thin, beaten folder labeled Lynx Cub 2021. She hadn't touched it in years. She carried it to the kitchen table, fingers trembling as she opened the clasp. Inside were his first vet notes, photos from the recovery period, hand-drawn sketches labeled with questions she'd never answered. Why didn't he fear Jasper? Why did he watch the fire? Why that nudge of the sketchbook? What did he understand? She closed the folder, slowly. Then she went to the porch. The wind had picked up, rustling through the trees like breath. Moonlight spilled over the treetops, painting the clearing in blue and silver. The same clearing where the wild boy had once appeared and disappeared. She sat on the top step with a thermos of tea, letting the chill soak into her bones. Somewhere far off, an owl called once, then silence again. And in that silence, she whispered what she'd never said aloud. "I loved you." The words didn't feel strange. They felt real, grounded, earned. She hadn't spoken them to anyone in years. Not since her parents passed. Not since the world outside the forest faded into static. But she'd loved him, not as a pet, not as a possession, as something greater, something ancient, a connection without words, forged in fire of survival, stitched together with trust, breath by breath. And now, she had no way to know if he still lived, or if he had ever truly been hers. She rose, stepped into the yard, and walked to the cedar fence that overlooked the ridgeline. From her coat pocket, she pulled out something small, Jasper's old leather collar, cracked at the edges, his name tag still clinking softly in the wind. Grace tied it to the post with a single knot. Then she placed her sketchbook beside it, opened to the last drawing she had made of the lynx, for years ago, when he curled beside her feet like a shadow refusing to leave. She left it there. A gift, a message, a goodbye, or maybe an invitation. And then she turned back toward the cabin, the porch light casting her silhouette long behind her, not knowing that the forest was already listening, and something had begun to stir. Eyes in the dark. The storm came without warning, a sharp shift in the air, clouds gathering like clenched fists over the ridgeline. The wind roared to the pines with a voice Grace hadn't heard in years, not just weather, but something wilder, something old. She bolted the shutters and stocked the firewood. The electricity flickered twice, then gave up altogether. No cell signal. No outside world. Just the mountains. Just her. Night fell hard, wrapped in layers. Grace settled by the fire, mug of tea untouched beside her. Her eyes kept drifting to window. She didn't know why, just a feeling. A pull. That strange weight that settles just before something changes. And then she heard it. A sound too light for wind, too deliberate for branches. A scratching, soft, steady, against the side of the tool shed. She froze. No one should be out here. Not at this hour. Not in this storm. She grabbed her flashlight, heart pounding, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit like a slap. Snow fell in thick sheets, swirling in the beam of the light. She moved slowly, boots crunching across frozen ground, breath fogging with every exhale. There, the shed. Another scratch. She held her breath and stepped closer, the beam landing on the wooden door. Silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, it opened, and he was there, standing just inside the threshold. Snow clinging to his fur, ears pricked forward, eyes glowing amber in the light. It was him, bigger now, powerful, no longer a cub of full-grown lynx. Shoulders wide, coat thick in silver, tail tipped in coal black, muscles coiled with tension. But his face, that face. Grace knew it like she knew her own. She whispered his name, though she'd never spoken one for him. just a sound, half-thought, born from memory. His ears twitched. He didn't run, didn't growl. Instead, he stepped forward, and from behind him, two small figures emerged. Tiny, trembling, eyes wide and wild. Kits. Lynx kits. Grace's hand flew to her chest. He had brought them. Not just returned, but returned with something fragile. Precious. Trusting her again after all this time. She knelt in the snow, not moving closer. Just waiting. The adult lynx stared at her, then blinked, slow, deliberate. And in that blink, for years melted away. He remembered. Of course he did. He turned to the kits, nudged them forward gently. One pawed the snow, hesitant. The other scampered ahead, nearly bumping into Grace's boots before darting back. Grace smiled, heart aching in the best kind of way. "You brought them home," she whispered. The lynx looked at her once more, then sat. Not asking, not testing, just being there, in the storm, beneath the pines, in the place where wild and human once met, and met again. They stayed there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. Grace, kneeling in the snow, heart thudding like a distant drum. The lynx, calm as stone, but watching her with those same amber eyes that once blinked at her from a fleece-lined crate beside the fire. Only now they held something deeper. Not fear, not uncertainty. Recognition. The kits, no older than 12 weeks, by her guess, peeked from behind their father's legs, snow-caught in their whiskers. One had a darker coat, nearly slate gray with faint ghost markings along its back. The other was pale, almost silver-white, with oversized paws and a nervous twitch in its ear. Grace didn't move, didn't speak again. She knew the rules of this moment. Any sound, any gesture too fast, and it would vanish. The whole miracle would scatter like birds from a gunshot. But the adult lynx didn't flee. Instead, he rose, padded slowly toward her, silent as falling snow. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough she could see the healed scar across his front paw, the one she treated years ago. She dared to breathe. "You remembered," she said softly. Then something impossible happened. The lynx stepped closer, not enough to touch, but enough to brush the edge of her shadow. He lowered his head, not submissively, not weakly, but as if in acknowledgement. And then, with one deliberate motion, he brushed his cheek against the edge of her boot. Not affection, not ownership, respect. She felt tears sting her eyes. Behind him, the kits mewed softly and darted in and out of the falling snow, chasing each other in short, clumsy bounds. It was surreal. A family in her yard. A wild family. And at the center of it, a bond 4 years in the making. Grace didn't reach out. She didn't need to. The lynx had already said everything. With his presence, with his trust. With what? Who? He brought back to her. Then, as silently as it arrived, the lynx turned. He gave one last look over his shoulder, a soft exhale that fogged in the freezing air. The kits scrambled after him, bounding through the drifts. He vanished into the trees. Gone again. Grace stayed where she was, knees numb in the snow, her breath coming in shaky bursts. She wasn't sad. Not this time. She felt full, like something had been stitched back into place. Not closure. Not goodbye. Just completion. As she rose and walked back to the porch, the storm began to lift. The clouds peeled back, and the stars came out one by one, scattered across the sky like tiny lanterns. Grace looked down. In the snow outside her door were 4 sets of tracks. 1 large, 2 small, and her own facing them, intertwined, paw prints and proof. The morning after their visit, the world was silent, not empty, but hushed reverent, as if the forest itself understood something sacred had passed through in the night. Grace stepped outside with a steaming mug of coffee, the snow crunching under her boots. The air was crisp, the kind that stung the lungs and cleared the fog from the mind. Every branch glistened with frost, every leaf perfectly outlined like a painting. And there, in the snow just beyond the porch, was proof. 4 sets of tracks, precise and unbroken, leading from the tool shed to the tree lean. The lynx's prints were wide, heavy, with that distinctive inward curve at the toes. The kits were smaller, lighter, weaving around as in chaotic patterns. And beside them, unmistakably, were her own footprints from the night before. Grace knelt beside the trail, her hand hovering just above one of the larger paw prints. She didn't touch it. She didn't want to. Some things weren't meant to be disturbed. Instead, she followed the tracks slowly through the clearing, each step measured, her breath catching her throat every few yards. The trail led past Jasper's grave, and there, on top of the small wooden marker, sat something that hadn't been there before. Her old sketchbook, the one she'd left out. It had been moved, placed deliberately, centered, unspoiled by snow or claws. The pages had been turned. Not ripped, not chewed, just shifted, open now to a drawing she didn't remember making. The lynx standing at the edge of the woods, his silhouette backlit by moonlight, eyes watching something far beyond the trees. She stared at it, stunned. Had she drawn that? Had she imagined it? Or had he chosen it? Grace didn't know. But in that moment, she didn't need to. A breeze rustled through the trees, soft and sudden. It carried with it the faint scent of pine, cold earth, and something else. Something wild. She stood there for a long time, the sketchbook in her arms, the wind tugging gently at her coat. Then she walked back to the porch and retrieved Jasper's old collar from a fence post. The leather was stiff from the cold, the metal tag still engraved with his name and her phone number. She held it for a moment, then smiled. He'd carried them both. The lynx hadn't just come back to show his kits. He'd come to complete the circle, to honor what had been, to remind her that nothing in the wild is ever truly lost. Only change, moved, echoed in the lives that follow. She placed the collar inside the cabin, on the mantel, beside the folded fleece blanket the lynx had once slept on. Her fingers brushed the fabric like a farewell. Outside, the paw prints were already fading beneath fresh snow, but their impression would never leave her. Not now, not after everything. Spring took root early that year. Snow melted into rivulets that ran like silver veins through the forest, feeding the roots of trees and waking up the moss-covered rocks. The air softened. The sky stayed lighter a little longer each evening. Birds returned. So did the sound of life. But Grace was changed, not in a loud, cinematic way, not in ways the world would notice. She still woke early, still stacked firewood, still walked the same trails Jasper once led, still returned calls from the Wildlife Center. But everything she did was tinged with quiet clarity, like she had finally stepped into the rhythm of something larger than herself. And she knew exactly when it had begun. Not the day she found the lynx cub, not the night he returned, but the moment he brought his kits. That was the message. Not words, not anything spoken, but a gesture, the kind only the wild can give. A silent offering of trust, not just once, but twice. She started drawing again. Not just sketches, but full pages. Landscapes where shadows stretched long across the trees. A mother elk pausing mid-step. A hawk diving over the ridgeline. And always, somewhere hidden, amber eyes, tufted ears, the curve of a tail. She didn't keep the drawings for herself. She mailed a few to local wildlife centers, one to a school in Twist that had asked her years ago for a guest lecture. She began teaching again, just once a month. Small groups, local kids, anyone curious about the balance between wilderness and humanity. At the end of each talk, she'd tell a version of the story. A lynx cub rescued from a storm, a bond built in firelight, a return no one could have predicted. But she never called him a pet, never gave him a name. Some stories, she told them, are meant to stay unfinished. The children always asked, "Do you think he'll come back again? Do the babies still live in the forest? Would he remember you?" And she always answered the same. "I don't need him to come back," she said gently, "because I know he's out there, and he knows I'm here." Every so often, she'd find fresh prints near the edge of the property. Sometimes just one set, other times 3, never close, never for long, but enough to know the wild remembers. That bonds, when formed not from ownership but from trust, don't break. They stretch, they drift, they echo through years and trees and time. Grace stood one evening on her porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ridge. She closed her eyes and listened, not for a sound, but for a feeling. And there it was, soft, unmistakable, still with her. Always, in the quiet wilderness of the Cascades, Grace learned a truth we often forget. Real connection isn't forced, bought, or spoken. It's earned, through patience, through presence, through compassion without conditions. The wild lynx reminded us that healing can happen in silence, that trust takes time, and that sometimes the ones we let go are the ones who return when it matters most. In your own life, ask yourself, who or what have you been holding too tightly? And who have you loved enough to set free? At Paw Prints&Stories, we believe that every creature we touch leaves a mark, sometimes seen, sometimes not, but always felt. If this story stirred something in you, maybe it's time to listen to the wild in your own heart. And when it answers, follow it.